got your Bible, make your way to Romans chapter number 13. Romans chapter number 13. We'll look here this morning at verses 1 through 7. As we continue to look at the book of Romans, of course, as we've always said there, we ask ourselves a question. All right, and so this morning the topic may seem kind of weird to you to come from Scripture, right? But this morning we're going to talk about what the government has to do with Christianity. What the government has to do with Christianity. And so that's more of a statement, right? So you want your question. And so what is your duty to the government? What is your duty to the government? Okay. And so we're going to try to explain that to you in explaining the existence of the government from the scriptural standpoint and what Paul is writing to us here as we come to that in chapter number 13. Now you're going to notice as we come into this, there's not really a transition or introduction. All right, so Paul is writing. Paul has been talking about how we are transformed, right? We're not conformed to this world, but we are transformed by the renewing of our mind. And then he is teaching us how that takes place in the following scriptures. Now, he just got done in chapter number 12 telling us how to live peaceably with all that's in us, with all men, right? He's told us that we are to live and we are to love and we are to act in that of kindness. And now suddenly, all of a sudden, right, no introduction, no transition, he just starts talking about government. And we would think maybe it's out of place. We would think, oh, well, he just kind of drifted off topic like some of us do. But it actually has a place, and it actually helps us in our thinking because it ties directly into life in general, right? Now, I'm not about to preach to you a message that says, all right, we're not supposed to, support the government or we're not supposed to understand that of prosecution and all those things. That we're not going to talk about trying to be anarchists, okay? We're going to talk about where we fall inside of this with our beliefs, okay? How we are to view our government, and we are to exist under their rule and their reign, but at the same time, we must know that they cannot misrule and misreign. Okay, it is our job and our duty as Christians, and we understand this text this morning to hold all those accountable, and that includes those who are in the position to lead us. Okay, and so the Bible tells us this in chapter number 13, verses 1 through 7. It says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, the powers that be ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resisteth shall receive themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor." And so as he begins to write this, he uses the word there in verse 1. He says, subject unto the higher powers. Okay, so this is where we're getting our government. So we're understanding those who rule. Now I want you to also understand this is not just big government, this is little government. What he's saying is all of those who have been put into authority over you, and this is from the president to even the dog catcher, so to say. Everyone who holds this position in our society that is to help regulate and put into these things of rule. He says, all right, he says, you understand that they are subject to God and you are subject to them in your subjection to God. Right? And he lays it out before us because here's what's happening in the Roman Empire. So you've got to remember the context of the writing. You've got to remember who he's writing to. And here he is writing to Christians in Rome. and you find that Rome has been through multiple types of government. Okay, they've been under that of a monarch. They've been under that of just general autocratic and democracy, and they have been under just this different type of rule that has now evolved into this empire. That's where we get this Roman Empire, right? There's an emperor, right? At this point in time, there is an emperor by the name of Nero. Okay, he is the 5th emperor to come into the Roman Empire. He is one of the most evil rulers of all time. He viewed the Jewish people as a sect. Okay, he viewed them as a rebellious people. And he was in constant fear that they would try to rise up, and so in a sense, he would actually purposely oppress them. In fact, at one point in time, there was a rule that they could not even be in Rome if they were Jewish. Okay? So what we find is there are different types of government, and there are different types of rule that go into place. And as Paul presents this to us, and he's presenting it to that day and time, what he's ultimately telling us here is something that you and I must understand, and that is there is no perfect government. Okay? There is no right government. The only government that exists is the government that God ordains. And as time changes, as people changes, as belief changes, then God will change that government to fit that people. All right? That's why you see throughout history why there's all these different types of rulers. Right? Now here's the reality this morning. You understand that all of us, we would sit here and we would say, yeah, we believe in democracy. We love democracy. We think democracy is the best. And though it may be the best in our eyes, it does not mean it's what everybody needs. Okay? And so Paul is going to help us understand this, because you can believe the Jews there, the believers there in Rome, they're looking at this emperor, they're looking at this Roman rule, and they're saying, hey, this is against God. This is not for God. We don't want this. We don't like this. And then Paul writes to them and he reminds them, hey, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. He says, you may not like the government. You may not like who's in charge. He said, but your job is not to like them, it's to be subject to them. It's to understand they've been put in that position by God. And so the first thing that we look at here this morning that Paul is telling us is where our government comes from. Okay. Where our government comes from. Where our government comes from. Where does it originate? Right? Where does it, where was it developed? Right? Well, God. That's what verse number 1 establishes for us. You want to know where government came from? You want to know how it originated? Well, it originated by God. He established it. He created it. He's the one who began to put people into places and rule, because you understand this morning that God is not a Democrat. God is not a Republican. God is not a communist. He's not a Marxist. You understand this morning that God's not even an American. Okay? He's God. And there's no title, there's no rule, there's no party that you're going to find He's associated with, because He establishes what needs to be established for man as it involves and correlates to where they are in their walk, in their life. Right? And so we must understand that government originates from God, because it helps us to understand our way of thinking. Remember, all of this has to do with renewing our mind. All of this has to do with changing the way we think about things and not thinking of the way of the world or this age that we live in. Okay? And so we have a viewpoint. We look at people like Hitler and Stalin and we say they're horrible, that's not right, no one should ever be that way. But you understand that in that day and time, when you understand that God originates government, that God said this is what these people need at this time. And that's hard, because it was not a good time, right? So we have a hard time understanding how a good God allows something to take place that overall we don't view as good, but what we must understand is that it works for good. Because if those things had not happened in the time of history, then we would not find ourselves living in a free nation the way we do today. Everything plays a part in a greater picture. And so government is something that God has designed. It's something that He has put into place, and it's something that He uses as it relates to the understanding and the morality of the people. So what the people need, God provides them with. Whether it's democracy, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's simple dictatorship, whether it's an emperor, right? God does what is needed during that time that correlates to the people. It always reminds me how many times people go in prayer in this day and age, and they go back to Isaiah, and they want to talk about how we, the people, if we would turn back to the ways of God, then He would heal our land, right? We preach that. And here's the reality of it, okay? We preach it in two parts. We preach it in the idea that we need to humble ourselves, but we also preach it in a way that God is going to change things, and we don't actually see the correlation, okay? Based on the people determines the government that God is going to give. You get that? Okay, so He looks at how His children are. He looks at how the people that are not His children are, and He takes society and He says, all right, this is what they need at this time. Whether good or bad, He correlates it to you and I. And so that's why we can take that scripture and we say, if we'll humble ourselves, if we'll return unto God in His ways, then God can come through and He can do something. And that's how He does it. He does it by changing the government, the ones He's put into the authority, right? You're sitting here going, Brother Ben, I've prayed that prayer many times. I wish You would change our government. Well, it's going to take more than you to do that. Right? It's going to take more than a few churches in the Bible Belt to change the government. Right? Because it's society as a whole that plays into what God is doing here. And so he writes to these Roman Christians and he says, look, he says, I understand you don't like the government. I understand you don't like the rule. I understand that you're wondering why this is in place. He says, so I'm writing to remind you that God is the one who originates government. God is the one that puts the powers that be into power. All right? And so you have a duty to still be a Christian. No matter what's taking place, no matter what kind of rule it is, no matter what's happening around you, you still have a duty to live out the Christian life. Peter says it like this. 1 Peter 2:17, it says there that you and I shall honor the King. Right? So he says you still have respect. You still have a job to do. Daniel goes, we remember Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel is under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. That is that of a monarch. And he is one of the greatest kingdoms of the Old Testament time. And the Bible says there that he goes and he says, hey, look, you understand that God ruleth over the kingdom of men. And he tells Nebuchadnezzar there, he says, God giveth to whomever He will, and He setteth up whoever He will. So what he's saying there is, I recognize that God put you into this position, and regardless of what I think about you, I'm going to respect you because I understand God. I know how God works. And I know what God would expect of me to do. And so when we come to this part in our Christianity, we understand that we have a duty. We have a duty to serve under the government that is before us because it is God originated. And here's the crazy thing about it, is God will sometimes deliberately pick a man that is not capable. Right? God has the ability to pick someone who has no business being in the office and put them in the office. And we'll sit here and we'll go, why in the world are they in office? Right? Well, it's because God put them there. Right? And when I begin to think about how it correlates to the people, I begin to think about the people. Right? And I begin to say, God really looks at us and goes, they couldn't handle somebody that actually knew what they were doing. Right? They never adhered to it. Why? Because you and I know that we live in a world today that has a problem with government, has a problem with authority, right? And so God understands that too. And so God puts those in place that need to be in place to handle these situations how He sees fit so that He can get everything going the way He needs it to be going, right? Okay? And so not only do we see how government come about, but the second big thing that Paul helps us with here this morning in the remainder of these verses is our relationship to the government. Okay? So we see how the government comes about. We see how it originates, right? And then now we look at our relationship to the government, because we've established God is behind the government. Okay? God has ordained the government. He has created the order. And so what he says here, he says in verse number 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So he says, all right, anyone who seeks to oppose the government or to overthrow it is opposing God. They're trying to overthrow God. Okay? So anyone who is against the government and their rule and their lead is actually saying that we are against God and what God is doing. Okay? So that kind of changes the way we begin to look at things, right? Because now we're talking about what is our relationship to it. And God says, look, he says, I've established the powers that be. I've established this government, and this government has a God-given right, okay? They have a God-given right to punish anyone who tries to overthrow them. They have a right to punish anyone who commits treason. They have a right to resist being overthrown. They have a right to control riots. The government has a right to preserve themselves by the use of power and force. Government has that right, and that's what Paul is writing to the people and saying here, all right? He's saying, you understand in these following verses, he's saying they have a right to rule over you. And so you can decide whether you want it to be good or you want it to be bad. But God has ordained it, and he has made it so. And so to resist it is to resist God himself. What he's establishing is you need to understand your place in society and your place with God. You'll remember back in the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke both talk of Jesus as he's standing there, and they're basically arguing about paying taxes, right? He says, anybody got a coin? Let me see it, right? He holds that coin up and he says, whose face is on this coin? They say, well, that's Caesar, okay? And he says, all right then. He says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. All right, so we understand the teaching of that is the image that is stamped on something. And so he says, if it has Caesar's image on it, it belongs to Caesar. But if it has God's image on it, it belongs to God. And so you understand you as a person are made in the image of God. And so you and your body, that's what Paul's writing about, right? Is give your body as a living sacrifice. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so it's made in the image of God. It belongs to God. And so God says, this is how you give it back to me. And as far as that change in your pocket, well, you give it back to whoever's face is on it, because it ain't got nothing to do with me. Right? And so he established this. He says, all right, government has a right to rule. They have a right to enforce. They have a right to power. And then he says, and they have a right to collect what is theirs. All right? You understand here today that the government has the authority over you and I to tell us what to do with our property. Right? To a degree, they have a right to tell us how to behave with one another. But you know what they can't do? They can't tell us how to worship God. They cannot tell us that we cannot obey God. There's one thing that remains true, and this is what Paul wants to make sure that you and I understand, is that if government goes against the things of God, then government has overstepped its bounds ordained by God. Right? And so if government, if the powers that be start trying to tell me and you to do the things that God says don't do, we've got a problem, because they can't do that. If the government starts trying to tell us that we can't do things that God has commanded us to do, then we've got a problem. But God says, you understand that I ordained this. I put this into place. I put these men into place. And because of that, I've created a relationship that exists. And so outside of that, you understand that government does not have certain rights. See, government design is not made to enslave men that belong to God. That's not how God is designated. The government is not designed to oppress men. He's not into that, right? God has made it so that you and I bear the image, and so there is a respect that is given to that. So what is God's, and what is Caesar's, and they don't cross the line. That's why during COVID and all that kind of stuff, there was a big uproar, is because you had some people forgetting who was in what role. You had some powers that be forgetting that their power is sanctioned by God, and it doesn't mess with the things of God, right? And you rest assured that there were some that stood for the right, and there were some that didn't. But I can tell you this today, when this is all said and done, and this life is over, everybody will give account for what they've done. You ain't got to worry about the government. Whoever serves in those positions, they're going to answer for whatever they did. It's not up to me and you to crucify them. Lord, take care of them when the time comes, right? But we need to understand our relationship. We need to stop worrying about what they're doing, and we need to get focused on what we're doing. Okay? So God says inside this relationship, there are some legitimate functions. Okay? There are some things that have to take place. There are some things that have to be in order. Okay? And if anybody comes in and they begin to oppress your religious belief or your practice, then you have a right to resist. You have a right by nonviolent means, okay, to go against the government. Because God has ordained it. They don't do the things of God because the things of God belong to God. Okay? And so, in this relationship, okay, Paul is going to help us here. The first is two sections of verses. Verses 3, 4, and 6 go together. Okay, so you can make your note of that as we talk about our relationship to the government. Verses 3, 4, and 6 go together. And so you understand that then 5 and 7 will go together. Okay, and so we typically read in order, we put everything together, but for the context of what we're looking at, as we accept government as a gift from God, as we accept it in its place, then we understand these things, okay? And so he says here in verses 3, 4, and 6, I'm going to read them, okay? It says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same." I'm going to stop right there and just tell you what Paul's saying, okay? Because you're reading that going, yeah, I really don't know what's happening here, okay? This is what he's saying. You're driving down the freeway, and you're doing the speed limit. When you're driving down the freeway doing the speed limit, guess what? You don't have to keep looking in your rearview mirror. You don't have to keep worrying if the highway patrolman is going to stop you, right? In fact, at no point in time is he going to stop you, because this is what he says, right? He says, "Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same." So he says, this is like the highway patrolman pulling you over and going, "Hey, noticed that you were doing the speed limit there. Just wanted to let you know. Good job." Right? They're not pulling you over for that, are they? Right? But what he's saying here is trust in this. If you know the law and you do it, if you know what the rule says and you follow it, then you will receive praise for it. Okay? But he says if you don't do it, all right, if you don't do it, then understand that you should be afraid, right? Because that's what you're doing when you're looking in the mirror. You're afraid you're about to get caught, okay? And so Paul says, all right, he says when it comes to your relationship with the government, you need to understand if you'll do those things which is good, then you'll receive praise. You know, they'll go on by you. They're not going to be worried about you, right? But if you don't want to do what they say, then you're going to receive a punishment, so to say. Right? Then he goes on in verse number 4 and he says, "For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." Okay? And so he comes in and he says, all right, there's two basic functions here of government. Okay? They are to protect us from evil, and they are to preserve the security of the people. Okay, what's the government's job? What are they supposed to do? Well, they are supposed to protect us from evil and preserve the security of the people, right? They are literally supposed to protect us from being attacked. Right? They're supposed to protect us and preserve us from evil that may exist in our midst, right? He says they are the minister of God. Now, in this text, you're going to see him use the word minister of God or God's ministers 3 different times. The first time he's using it, the word interprets there as deacon, as they have a service to the people. The last time he says it, he's using the interpretation of the word translated priest. Okay? So he says they are to administer this. Okay? And so he says they have a duty to serve the people, and then they have a duty to provide to the people. Okay? So we'll kind of hit what that really distincts here in a moment. But then he goes on in verse number 6, and he says, "For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually unto this very thing." Okay, and so he's established. All right, here's the hard part: that you must pay your taxes. Okay, that's what that means. Okay, Paul writes so. He says, "All right," he says, "you understand that you have a duty, and your duty is to give tribute where tribute is due. Your duty is to pay taxes when taxes are due." Right? Now, here's the great thing about our government, okay, is because not only is it to protect us from evil, but it's also to commend us for good, right? Every now and then, I know it doesn't happen a lot, right? But every now and then, you'll hear your judicial system where they will reward those that have done good. Right? Let me give you an easy example, right? Prisoners get reduced sentences or they get released because of good behavior, right? That's commendations, okay? So that's the government practicing its right to do good unto its citizens, okay? Now, we may not agree with it, we may not like it, but that's part of the rules that are in place, okay? They tell the story, an example of this is a man one time, he was arrested and he was taken to jail for stealing a loaf of bread. It says there the man, he couldn't keep a job, didn't have any way to work and maintain an income, and his family was hungry, and so he went out, stole this loaf of bread. They caught him, they put him in jail. He goes before the judge looks at him and he says, I'm sorry, but the law says that I must persecute you. The law says this is the rule, and I can't, this is the payment. And so therefore, I am going to have to find you guilty, and I'm going to have to fine you. He says the court orders that you pay the fine of $10. Now remember, this man has no money, has no job, he's been locked up trying to feed his family. But then the judge looks at him, and knowing the circumstance, he says, I fine you $10, but I'm going to pay it. He pulls $10 out of his pocket, he hands it to the man, and then he says, this court also finds that there will be no fine due this date. And so he not only gives the man $10, but he says, you don't have to give it back to the court. That's your $10. Right? And then he says, by further rule of the court, I'm now going to ask the bailiff that if he would take off his hat and pass it around, and everyone in this court put in 50 cents, because you are now found in contempt for living in a city that would put a man in jail for trying to feed his family. And what he says here, and what the illustration is you understand that government and the power to rule can be used for good too. There are times in the courtroom where a case is presented and the judge, having the discernment or the gift of God to weigh out the wrong and the right, sees that maybe there was wrongdoing, but it was all for the right cause. And they make a judgment that is different from what is expected. Right? And so Paul reminds us, hey, you do what you are to do, and you understand that God will do what He's going to do. But even in the midst of government, He still has the power to sway a decision, right? To change an outcome. See, God is the one that lies in power of all things. But He says, not only this, He says, hey, they've got a right to protect you they've got a right to preserve your securities. But he says this about government also, okay? He says that government has a right to defend. Okay? Government has a right to defend. That's why there's an army. That's why there's policemen, right? Because the government has a right based on the Constitution, right, to defend, to maintain the peace, right? And so as he helps us with this, he says it's not just the paying of your taxes that come into play here, but those taxes help the government do their job in defending you and the nation. The reason that those are due, the reason that that is paid, is because it goes back into a system so that that system provides you something. So he says this, okay? In order for this to be possible, all right, there are two powers given unto the government, okay? The first power is using force. First power the government has in the defending of the nation and the people is the power to use force. This is God ordained, okay? You understand this. It didn't just come from a constitution, it come from God. Right? God says it this way in His Word. Okay? He says He bears not the sword in vain. Right? There in verse number 4. He bears not the sword in vain. What He's saying here is the sword is a symbol of the right to use force. And it's a symbol even in the taking of life. So we're not going to get really big into all these different entities of what can take place and laws and all that, but I'm going to give you an example to understand here, okay? It's capital punishment. There's been a lot of debate over that over the years. It's one of those topics that keep coming up. I'm not here to debate it with you. I'm here to help you understand how God is involved in it, okay? And here's the thing, you're going to have the government say, hey, there's no capital punishment, there's not going to be any death penalty. Then you're going to have a state. The state's going to come up, rise up. It's been several years ago, but we've heard of states that do this, right? They come up and they say, hey, we've got a right as a state to make our decision, and we have decided that if the penalty is death, then the life will be taken. Right? Capital punishment. Now you understand that when we begin to break down Scripture and we understand that God has ordained the government, that God has put these things into place, and God has said they have a right to protect the people, they have a right to defend the people, all right, then what you understand is that when a state steps out and they put into practice their constitutional right, okay, that what we're saying here is that it is not the state that is taking a life. It's not the president that's taking a life. It's not the country that is taking a life. What you find is through the working of the judicial system, if everything is in line and acting accordance to the law set in place, then what you see is that a person who has to yield their life for a certain crime that calls for their life is actually God. It's actually God practicing capital punishment. It's actually God taking a life by way of the law. Right? And you say, that's just crazy, I don't agree with it. Well, you just go back and read your Old Testament a little while. How many times did He take a life? Thousands of them. Right? You understand that when it comes to the judicial system, when it comes to righteousness, and it comes to justice, that God is going to deliver rightly and correctly every time. And so if you dare to read the Old Testament compared to the New Testament that we live today, then what you're going to find is you're going to be thankful for some law. You're going to be thankful that there's a judge in place. You're going to be thankful that there's some rules by a Supreme Court, because if it was up to God, there'd be a lot of us wiped out for a lot less. But God ordained it to make it possible. Why? Because in the gist of all of it, God is trying to make it where we live peaceably with each other. God's not trying to destroy everybody. God says, you understand, I've put these things in place for a reason, because they invoke the very nature of what I would do. And so when it comes to crimes that call an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, God says, you understand, my punishment says I'll take it every time. Right? By way of the judicial system, it's not so like that, but it still happens. Because that's the law. Right? And God says your relationship to it is to respect it. He says not only does the government have a right to force, but he says that the government has every right to protect, provide common services, and collect taxes. Okay, so this brings it back from not just defending, but providing. Okay, he says it's not just there to protect you, but it's also there to provide for you. And one of the ways it provides for you is by the collection of taxes, right? So the final position we found there in verses 5 and 7, it says, wherefore you must needs be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. And then verse 7 it says, render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Okay, so he comes about and he says, all right, you understand that the government has a job to do. They are not only to provide you with protection, but they're to provide you with utilities, like water and sewage. They're to provide you with U.S. mail services, right? That doesn't come from some private entity. It's government-based, right? He says they have a right to provide all of these things to you. And so because they provide all of these things to you, they have a right to collect taxes from you. All right? Now you understand that taxes have been in place since the beginning of time. Since the creation of government, men and women have been taxed. It's nothing new. Okay? They didn't just come up with it, right? But you and I, the reason Paul writes this, right, is to help us. Because we've got to change our perspective. Okay? That's what it's about. So when we look at government, we've got to see government ordained by God. We've got to see government practicing under the rule of God. And we've got to see that our job is to be subject to that government. Not rise up against it, not fight against it, not throw rocks at it, but it is to obey it. Then he says, inside of that, you also have a right not only to serve, that's what it comes to when protecting. Not only do they have a right to have an army and police, but they have a right to call you into service for that nation and that service that they provide, right? Now, we don't like a draft. We don't want to talk about a draft, but it has existed. Why? Because it is the government's right. Okay? They have the power to do that. Okay? And then lastly, he says here, they have a right to collect from you. Okay? And so this morning, I know it's no fun, right? We know tax season is upon us. Right? We know everybody's getting all ready to pay them. Right? You understand this morning that I pay taxes just like you do. I don't get any kind of refund based on preaching messages about it. Right? It's the same for everybody. There's nothing special. But here's the deal. This is what God says for us. Right? So you give to them what is owed. Okay? You and I spend many days, right, arguing about it, complaining about it, fussing about it, right? Because nobody likes writing a big check, or a check in general, right? Nobody likes giving back to the government that's provided. And so Paul's helping them understand, okay? Just because you don't like them doesn't mean they ain't doing stuff for you, right? Doesn't mean that they, I don't know about you, but I get it. They do get a paycheck, but at the same time, I don't want to be riding on the garbage truck at 6 a.m. every morning, right? Cold, rain, it don't matter. Your garbage still gets picked up, don't it? Why? Because the city provides you with a utility that is required by the state through the federal government, right? Your mail still gets delivered, right? Even if it may not be exactly when you want it to be there, it's going to be there before nightfall. Why? Because they have a duty to uphold these things, right? And so they have a right to collect taxes in order to uphold their job or duty to you. So your duty to them is to just agree and do what you're supposed to do. Right? What Paul is literally telling us here is that when it comes time to pay taxes, you and I should be happy to give back, right? Right? We're more like that guy that wrote the letter to the IRS, right? He wrote the letter. He said, look, I've had a lot of trouble sleeping. He said, I just can't get over what I've done, and so I've enclosed a check for $50. And if I still can't sleep, I'll send you the rest of it, right? So we want to hold on to it, right? I'll give you a little bit, but don't you push it too far, right? But Paul comes to us and Paul says, look, he says, you've got to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And he said, when you begin to understand what all of this ties into, then you begin to take this. This is not me giving my taxes to a government. This is me giving to God. This is not me giving to a man, though it may go into the hands of a man, though it may be used by a man. This is something that God has ordained because He's allowed it. Because He's allowed it, I must be obedient to it. Right? He says, don't be conformed to this world. Don't take on the view of everyone else. Right? So if there's an injustice, if there's something that is being done wrong, if there's action being taken, if you feel like they didn't collect properly, right? If you believe that they got some of their numbers off, you have every right to challenge it, right? But what he says is what is owed is owed, okay? And he adds it like that. He says, therefore, to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Right? He says, give every part and every person what is theirs. And in so doing, you're doing the will of God. You're doing what is required of you. Right? Somebody wrapped this up and they said it like this. They said, this is what Paul is dealing with. Every nation gets the government it deserves. Right? You and I are thankful today that we have a democracy, but you understand that democracy doesn't belong to everybody. And I can remember, right? You remember that many wars have been fought trying to make other people become a democracy. It didn't work, did it? Why didn't it work? Because God ordains government. God gives people what they need when they need it, whether we agree with it or not. And so every nation gets what they deserve. And inside of that government, there are requirements that are owed. Whether it be respect or it be taxes. And God says, whatever is asked of you, you give of it. Because God has ordained it. So it doesn't matter if it's the worst government ever, okay? That's better than anarchy. You get it? I don't care if you never agree with anybody that rules over you for the rest of your life. It's better than everyone uprising and trying to overturn the government. Because that leads to disaster. That makes for a mess. Right? So though we may not agree with some things, we understand that they are in place for a reason. And you and I need to have an attitude that doesn't attack it, but is subject to it. We understand God's place in it. We understand our place in it. And that's how we reside peacefully. And it's through the renewing of our mind.